June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. A checkers match lay mid-move when Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald looked up from the board. The man at his screen door had just given his name, but it hadn't quite clicked yet. MacDonald's attention was on his game with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer of Satan's Angels. The civilian repeated himself with a calm assurance that made MacDonald pause. Charles Lindbergh. The Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous flyer, was standing in a rough, improvised rec hall thousands of miles from home, asking to talk about P-38 combat procedures. Neither man yet realized that this interruption would reshape long-range fighter practice in the Pacific. Over the next 6 weeks, the methods Lindbergh taught would push the Lockheed P-38 Lightning's combat radius out by nearly 400 mil, turning what pilots thought couldn't be done into everyday routine. The tale of how a civilian consultant doubled the reach of America's premier twin-engine fighter isn't just a technical note. It's a story of habit and doctrine giving way to proof, of pilots learning to trust numbers over instinct, and of one man's deep mastery of fuel economy altering the course of air war in the Pacific. The math of long legs wasn't being penned in engineering textbooks so much as written in pilots' daily logs as they discovered that everything they'd been taught about engine handling left out critical pieces. The unthinkable was about to become standard, and the instructor was a 42-year-old civilian who hadn't even flown a P-38 3 days before. The road to that screen door at Hollandia started 17 years earlier, high over the Atlantic. On May 20th to 21st, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh changed aviation forever by flying 3,600 meters from New York to Paris solo in 33.12 hours. The Ryan NYP monoplane he piloted, the Spirit of St. Louis, held 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so large they blocked the forward view. Lindbergh navigated by periscope and dead reckoning, husbanding fuel with a precision other pilots of the time would have called obsessive. He touched down at Labor Field with 85 gallons left, having coaxed fuel economy from a right whirlwind radial that experts said simply couldn't be done. That meticulous focus on fuel became Lindbergh's defining technical edge. Through the 1930s, as he ran survey flights for Pan American Airways across the Pacific and Atlantic, Lindbergh sharpened techniques that stretched range far beyond the numbers printed by manufacturers. He realized the published figures were averages, not walls. Every engine has a sweet spot where power, fuel burn, and mechanical stress balance perfectly. Finding it means understanding how manifold pressure, propeller RPM, mixture, and indicated airspeed interact, far beyond standard training. By 1944, Lindbergh was one of the world's authorities on long-range flight, but his bond with the U.S. military was strained by his pre-war isolationism. He had argued fiercely against intervening in Europe, led the America First Committee, and earned President Franklin Roosevelt's hostility. On April 29, 1941, after Roosevelt publicly likened him to Civil War Copperhead Clement Vallandigham, Lindbergh resigned his Air Corps Reserve Colonel's commission. When Pearl Harbor dragged America into war, Lindbergh tried to rejoin the Army Air Corps. Roosevelt made sure he would not wear a U.S. uniform again during the conflict. But expertise finds a path. Barred from serving as an officer, Lindbergh became a civilian technical advisor to aircraft makers. He joined United Aircraft Corporation in 1943, working closely with their Chance-Vought division, builder of the F-4U Corsair. He spent time at Ford's Willow Run plant unraveling B-24 Liberator production snags. He flew risky, high-altitude test hops in P-47 Thunderbolts to analyze engine performance. He helped shape Corsair dive-bombing techniques. His technical impact was vast, but Lindbergh wanted combat time. By early 1944, he saw an opening. United Aircraft wanted to examine the prospects for a new twin-engine fighter, and the only American example in service was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh talked United Aircraft into sending him to the Pacific as a technical representative to watch P-38 operations under fire. On April 3, 1944, he prepared to ship out to the South Pacific. He stopped by Brooks Brothers in New York and bought a naval officer's uniform with no insignia. At Brentano's bookstore, he picked up a small New Testament, noting in his journal, "Since I can only carry one book, and a very small one, that is my choice." It would not have been a decade ago, but the more I learn and the more I read, the less competition it has. He left San Diego on April 24th, officially headed for Marine aviation bases around Guadalcanal. The Navy Department authorized the trip, but kept it from the White House. Neither the President nor even the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, knew Lindbergh was going into the war zone. What began as observation became more when Marine aviation officers invited him to fly as an observer on combat sorties. On May 21, 1944, he flew his first combat sortie, a strafing run with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the Japanese garrison at Rabaul. The Marines called it observation, but Lindbergh flew with the guns hot, firing when targets presented themselves. Quickly, he showed a practical edge beyond theory. Working with Corsair pilots, he taught them how to take off safely carrying bomb loads twice the F-4U's rated capacity. The Marines had been losing planes to overweight takeoff accidents. Lindbergh's careful study of power settings, lift-off speeds, and weight distribution cut losses while boosting strike power. Word rippled across the Pacific that the famous flyer was flying combat as a civilian and solving frontline problems that had stumped military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh's focus shifted to the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in twin-engine fighters was real, but Lindbergh had also heard the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, was one of the hottest Lightning outfits in theater. If he wanted to truly learn the P-38, that was the unit to join. On June 15, 1944, Lindbergh hitched a ride to Finchen, New Guinea. He announced himself to 5th Air Force Headquarters at NADSAB, where Colonel Marion Cooper had lunch with him. On Sunday evening, June 18th, he dined with General Ennis Whitehead, talking New Guinea operations and Lindbergh's plan to observe P-38 combat. The approval was informal, unofficial, and weak by strict rules. But in the loose command web of the Southwest Pacific, personal trust and proven skill often mattered more than paperwork. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent an hour and 20 minutes checking out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. It was his first time in the twin-boom fighter. On June 26th, he flew to Hollandia and walked in on McDonald's checkers game. McDonald was 29 and already a 10-victory ace. He led the 475th Fighter Group, activated in Australia on May 14, 1943, and now one of the top-scoring P-38 outfits in theater. Its three squadrons, the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd, flew the latest P-38J models with improved intercoolers and extra fuel capacity. These Lightnings were the Pacific's longest-legged fighters, able to fly missions no other type could match. Even so, drop tanks only went so far. Distant targets left thin fuel for fighting, and pilots often came home with fuel needles hugging empty. Several aircraft had been lost when weather forced longer detours than their fuel could cover. MacDonald first brushed Lindbergh off politely and returned to his game. But when Lindbergh said that General Hutchinson, commander of the 3rd Air Task Force, had sent him to talk P-38 combat operations, MacDonald listened. After a short exchange, he asked if Lindbergh wanted to fly a mission the next day. Lindbergh accepted. The launch would be at first light. Rather than sending him back to headquarters, MacDonald suggested he stay with the 475th to avoid transport hassles. As Lindbergh stretched out on a spare cot, news shot through the camp. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's angels. Reactions were mixed. Lieutenant John Perurdy of the 433rd looked forward to meeting the legend. Others were wary. Some doubted a 42-year-old civilian, famous or not, could handle modern air combat. Major Thomas Maguire, already sitting on 15 victories and destined to finish the war as America's number 2 ace with 38, wanted to see what the old guy had. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh suited up for his first P-38 combat hop. Weather was bad. Steady rain at 05:30. By 10:30, it had lifted enough to go. MacDonald led 4 ships toward Jeffman Island and Smart Airfield, regular 475th targets. Lindbergh flew Blue 3 on Maguire's wing. The 4th aircraft was flown by Merrill Smith, an 8 victory ace. MacDonald watched Lindbergh slide into perfect position on Maguire's wing. For someone who had only just checked out in the P-38, his formation work was spotless. The flight strafed an enemy barge in Kibos's Bay. Lindbergh threaded through flak, hosing the target with his cannon and machine guns. All 4 returned safely. But what crew chiefs found after landing mattered more than the shooting. After several hops, checks on Lindbergh's P-38 showed a pattern. His ship consistently came back with far more fuel than others flying the same profile. After a 6.5-hour armed recon on July 1st to strips along the western shore of Gilvink Bay, he landed with 210 gallons still aboard. Other pilots from the same mission were showing needles near empty. On July 3rd, the group escorted 16 B-25s, striking Jeffman Island. After bomb release, the Lightnings went barge hunting. Within an hour, 2 pilots called low fuel and headed home. Lindbergh kept working the target area, his gauges still easy. MacDonald noticed and called a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh arrived, the colonel gathered the 475th in their rec hall. It was a crude place, packed dirt floor under a palm-thatched roof, 1 ping-pong table, a few decks of cards. Under naked bulbs, MacDonald got straight to it. He formally introduced Lindbergh and asked him to explain how he always returned with more fuel than anyone else. What followed would change P-38 operations across the Pacific. Lindbergh stood before the pilots and laid out the cruise control techniques he had worked up for the Lightning. The P-38 standard operating procedure taught to every pilot called for cruising at 2,200–2,400 RPM with mixture at auto-rich. It gave solid power and was considered safe for the engines, but it wasted fuel. Lindbergh explained that by pulling RPM down from the usual 2,200 to 1,600, setting mixture to auto-lean instead of auto-rich, and bumping manifold pressure slightly to make up for the lower RPM, pilots could slash fuel burn without losing effective cruise speed. His specific recommendation: 1,600 RPM at 30 inches of mercury, mixture at auto lean, and indicated airspeed of 185 mph. Those settings cut total fuel burn to roughly 70 gall per hour, about 2.6 minnows per gallon. Compared with standard crews that drank much more, the savings were massive. Lindbergh predicted the lightning's radius could stretch by 400 minnow, enabling 9-hour sorties. When he finished half an hour later, the room went quiet. Pilots chewed on several uneasy thoughts. The idea of 9 hours in the seat didn't sit well with men who already found 7 brutal. The P-38 cockpit was tight. You sat on your parachute with a raft and oar under that. Survival suits chafed. 7 hours was already at the edge of what a body could stand. 9 sounded impossible. More troubling, Lindbergh wanted them to run settings they'd been told never to use. Low RPM and higher manifold was called running over square. Training hammered that over square made engines detonate. That would spike cylinder head temps and blow motors. Pilots were taught that if inches of manifold pressure got too far over the RPM, the engine might grenade. Now a civilian was telling them to use a regime they'd been warned against. Skepticism was thick. Glances were traded. A few heads shook. One pilot said flat out it was dangerous, but McDonald grasped the key point. Lindbergh wasn't talking theory. He had flown combat with those settings. His P-38 had not had engine trouble. His ship repeatedly returned with fuel reserves that gave options others lacked. The colonel chose to test it. If it worked, the 475th would gain a real edge. If it didn't, they'd know soon enough. Over the next week, pilots tried Lindbergh's settings carefully. The first flights were short, so they could get back fast if engines misbehaved. The first to try it reported that the engine sounded different at lower RPM. A deeper note from the Allison V-1710s, but the needles stayed where they should. Oil pressure was normal. Cylinder head temps, the key detonation indicator, actually ran cooler than at higher RPM. Confidence grew, and pilots used the technique on longer legs. The fuel savings were undeniable. Missions that had forced a straight return after the strike now allowed extra combat air patrol. Flights that had required strict fuel nursing now ended with comfortable reserves. The P-38's practical combat radius, about 570 miles, stretched to 700, then 750. Pilots found they could hit targets once thought out of reach, fight 15 minutes over them, and still come home with a 1-hour reserve. The shift was revolutionary. Doubts disappeared as sortie after sortie proved the point. Lindbergh flew regularly with the 425th, piling up hours and teaching by doing. He led flights, showing that the civilian observer could fight as well as any line pilot. On flights he led, his call sign was simple: Mr. Lindbergh. He also broke down the physics in ways that clicked. Engines make power by burning fuel to push pistons. Fuel burned per minute sets the consumption. The trick is getting the most power per gallon. Traditional high RPM crews made plenty of power, but wasted fuel because the engine cycled too fast, burning more than needed. By lowering RPM and nudging manifold pressure up, you get the same power with fewer combustion strokes, each using fuel more efficiently. Lean mixture improved it further by giving just enough fuel for full burn, cutting the extra used by auto-rich for cooling at high power. Engines didn't detonate because the overall power wasn't high. Over square by ratio, yes, but manifold at 30 inches is moderate, far below the 60-inch war emergency used for takeoff and combat. Lower RPM actually reduced mechanical stress. The method wasn't risky, just different from what they'd been taught. Lindbergh's skill came from years of long-range flying. His 1927 crossing taught him that published numbers were a baseline, not a limit. Pan-American survey work in the 1930s gave him thousands of hours to experiment with fuel handling. The P-38 had one built-in safety margin that made the trial less scary: the second engine. If one motor suffered from the new cruise regime, the other would get you home. Over empty Pacific water, where a dead engine meant drowning or capture, most single-engine pilots played it safe. The Lightning's redundancy gave room to explore the envelope, and Lindbergh knew the supply picture made the risk acceptable. Allison was shipping V-1710 engines and spares to the Pacific generously. If an engine needed swapping after the experiment, maintenance could hang a fresh power plant quickly. The operational gain from more range justified a small increase in wear. The bet paid off. No P-38 engines failed because of the cruise method. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's settings were spreading through 5th Air Force P-38 units. The 475th's results were too obvious to ignore. Word moved to other squadrons. Pilots talked. Crew chiefs compared fuel sheets. Other commanders wanted what Satan's angels had. Lindbergh briefed more pilots from other units. He walked through the details, answered worries about engine safety, and took questions. Adoption wasn't instant or universal, but it gathered steam. July 28, 1944, brought Lindbergh's most dramatic day with the 475th. It was a bomber escort to the Seram area with the 433rd Squadron. Lindbergh flew Blue 3 in a 4-ship over El Puti Bay. Blue flight met enemy aircraft. 2 Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonas, light bombers used for recon and ground attack, on their way back from a search. They belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. One was flown by the unit commander, Captain Saburo Shimada, the other by Sergeant Yokogi. The Americans attacked. The Sonas were outclassed, slower, clumsier, and lightly armed compared to Lightnings. They should have been easy kills, but Shimada was no novice and didn't plan to die easily. The fight became a running battle. P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron had already engaged when McDonald's flight arrived. Yokogi's Sona was hit by cannon fire from Lieutenant Wade Lewis. The left wing caught fire. As the bomber straightened to run, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip tucked in and fired a long burst. The stricken Sona smoked and dove into the sea. Shimada kept fighting. For 30 minutes, he outmaneuvered multiple P-38s. He threw the Sona into savage banks, wingtips streaming condensation as he hauled it through max rate turns. P-38 pilots tried pulling lead, but couldn't hold the aim point. The slower Japanese plane could turn inside the faster Americans. Captain Danforth Miller, McDonald's wingman, briefly got the Sona in his sights, but lost it as Shimada snapped a hard left. Miller's tracers fell 80 ft behind. Then Shimada did the unexpected. Instead of continuing evasives, he turned straight at Lindbergh. They charged head-on at a closing speed near 500 mm apiece. For Lindbergh, thousands of hours in the air but never yet facing an enemy trying to kill him, the moment crystallized. Shimada held course. Whether planning a ram or hoping to trade head-on fire, he committed. Lindbergh instinctively sighted on the Sona's radial and squeezed the trigger. The P-38's nose guns, one 20mm cannon and 4 50-caliber machine guns, spoke for 6 seconds. Lindbergh held the trigger down. Rounds hammered into the bomber's nose. The propeller slowed visibly. Smoke poured from the engine, but Shimada still held course. At the last second, Lindbergh yanked up, his P-38 flashing over the damaged Sona by feet. Shimada's aircraft pitched into a steep dive. Other P-38s fired again. The Sona kept diving, trailing smoke, and smashed into the ocean at speed. A white plume of spray marked the hit. Foam spread in rings, then the sea smoothed. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were dead. Back at base, the kill credit was debated. Several pilots had hit the Sona. McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh all scored, but Lindbergh's head-on burst crippled the plane, slowing the prop and starting the fatal dive. Unofficially, the decision was simple. Lindbergh had his first and only kill. It did not go into the 475th's official record. He was a civilian. His combat flying was already outside the lines. Recording a kill would raise questions that could end his time with the group. 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly died. The mission was a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands. They ran into Japanese Zeros. In the turning fight that followed, a Zero almost shot Lindbergh down. Only McDonald's call, break right, and his own attack on the Zero saved Lindbergh. The close call convinced 5th Air Force that the experiment had gone far enough. Lindbergh had made his case. Across his Pacific service, he had flown about 50 combat sorties, roughly 25 of them, with the 475th in P-38s. He had shot down an enemy. He had almost been killed. It was time to send him home before the worst happened. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh departed Hollandia for the United States. The 475th's pilots turned out to see him off. Their respect was real. He hadn't only taught them ways to stretch their fuel. He had flown and fought beside them, proving himself where fame and rank didn't count. The effect of his efficiency methods reached far beyond the 475th. By October 1944, P-38 units across the Pacific were using variations on his cruise settings. The exact number shifted with units and conditions, but the rule held: lower RPM, a bit more manifold pressure, and a leaner mix added up to dramatic range. The operational payoff was profound. Targets once out of reach became viable. Japanese bases that had seemed safe from fighter escort now saw P-38s with enough gas to fight over target and get home. Escorts could cover bombers on missions previously unescorted or not flown at all. Long fighter sweeps probed deeper into Japanese-held skies. P-38 groups in Dutch New Guinea were soon flying 950 milya to targets, fighting for 15 minutes and returning to base. That had been impossible before Lindbergh's methods became standard. The range gain wasn't a footnote. In the latter half of 1944, the extra radius enabled moves that backed MacArthur's push toward the Philippines. Airstrips that had been out of fighter range became usable forward bases. Invasion plans that would have waited for nearer fields could jump ahead. The strategy shifted not just in miles, but in time. Operations that might have taken months were done in weeks because fighters could reach farther, sooner. The techniques saved lives too. Pilots who used to land on fumes now had margin for emergencies. Weather-forced detours no longer meant certain losses. Damaged planes had a better chance of making it home. Extra fuel gave a buffer that directly cut non-combat losses. The extended legs mattered especially during the liberation of the Philippines. When MacArthur landed at Lae in October 1944, P-38s from New Guinea and Morotai provided cover over distances that had been unthinkable months before. The difference between arriving with no reserve and arriving with an hour of fuel meant the difference between effective cover and merely being present. Adoption wasn't frictionless. Some commanders balked at engine life concerns, some pilots clung to training over civilians' advice, some maintenance chiefs feared extra wear. But the data would not be argued away. Units using the method did not see more engine failures. Fuel logs showed stunning improvements. Mission reports confirmed successes that had been out of reach. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise method was written into P-38 procedures. What began as a civilian advisor's observation became doctrine. The USAIF published updated cruise charts reflecting his findings. Training material added proper lean of peak mixture practice. The wider story of Lindbergh's Pacific months shows a man driven by tangled motives. His pre-war isolationism made him a lightning rod. Comments on German technology earned him accusations of sympathy. His public stand against entering the war broke his relationship with Roosevelt. When war came, he became a pariah despite being among America's finest aviators. In the Pacific, far from Washington, he found redemption through competence. Marine and Army Air Forces pilots judged him not on politics, but on flying skill and nerve. Major Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, serving with V Fighter Command HQ and various units, told a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as hot a pilot as any of us. He would have been out there knocking off Japs every day if General Kenny had let him. Praise from Bong meant more than any political absolution. Lindbergh proved himself where it counted, in combat. Back in the United States in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh kept contributing. In October 1944, he joined a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland. He flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, offering insights on enemy capabilities. He continued consulting for United Aircraft and others, troubleshooting field problems as they emerged. The technical bottom line shows how big the change was. The P-38J carried 410 draw internally, 2 90-gallon mains, 2 60-gallon reserves, and 2 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with fittings for external drops. Total capacity could top 1,000 nsg. At standard cruise, 2,200 RPM and auto-rich. Burn rates varied by source, but were far higher than with Lindbergh's method. Lindbergh's settings cut total to about 70 gall per hour. Combat radius rose from roughly 570 milliparsec to about 750 with the same combat time in reserve, a 31% jump. For max range profiles, extra drop tanks plus the cruise method yielded flights near 9 hours, topping 1,000 miles. Those capabilities changed the Pacific fight. MacArthur's island-hopping plan through New Guinea and into the Philippines depended on air superiority at each step. Fighter range set which islands could be bypassed and which had to be seized for airfields. By extending range, Lindbergh's method let planners take bolder routes. Islands that would have needed costly assaults could be skipped because fighters could reach from further back. Some historians have wrongly tied Lindbergh's range work to the April 1943 mission that ambushed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. That raid, flown by P-38s of the 339th Fighter Squadron from Guadalcanal, pushed the Lightning's range, but Lindbergh played no part. He didn't arrive in the Pacific until more than a year later. His contribution was making extreme range flying routine instead of one-off heroics. The human side matters. Lindbergh was 42 in theater, fighting pilots 20 years younger. The G-loads, the stress, the discomfort of 7 to N-hour sorties in a cramped cockpit took everything he had. He asked for no special favors. He flew the same profiles, faced the same flak, and followed the same rules as the lieutenants and captains around him. His willingness to prove his case in the air was crucial. Had he lectured from a safe desk, pilots would have dismissed him as another theorist. By flying the missions and consistently making the numbers, he earned credibility no rank or celebrity could buy. The psychological effect went beyond fuel. He showed that civilian technical skill could matter directly in combat. Militaries naturally prize rank and combat time, but modern war needs technical depth that often lives outside the chain of command. Lindbergh proved that civilian specialists could boost combat power when leaders let them in. That success encouraged commanders to listen to factory reps and researchers. Cooperation between users and developers sped wartime innovation. The P-38 itself deserves credit as the platform that enabled it. Twin engines gave the margin that made experimentation survivable. The Allison V-1710, though criticized for various quirks, responded well to careful mixture work. The P-38's complex fuel system, with multiple tanks and transfer pumps, let pilots manage fuel precisely. Its stability made it a solid long cruise machine. By late 1944 and early 1945, some theaters were shifting to the P-51 Mustang for higher altitude performance and similar range, but in the Pacific, the P-38 kept its value. Twin engines meant safety over water. Heavy-nose guns hit hard. Its low to medium altitude handling fit Pacific fights, and with Lindbergh's crews, it remained exceptional on range. The final figures tell the story. The 475th Fighter Group, flying P-38s only, racked up 551 aerial victories, the top P-38 tally of the war. America's second-ranking ace, Major Thomas McGuire with 38, flew P-38s with the 475th. The type's blend of legs, punch, and reliability made it the theater's dominant fighter, and the extra reach Lindbergh delivered made every part of P-38 operations better. Missions went farther, fights lasted longer, and returns were safer. Across thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of hours, the cumulative effect can't be precisely measured, but it was real. The story also shows the uneasy fit between expertise and institutions. Lindbergh's pre-war stance made him unwelcome in uniform. Roosevelt's personal dislike kept him out. Yet the Air Forces needed exactly the specialty Lindbergh had. The workaround, unofficial civilian status with tacit approval to fight, was irregular and would break rules today. But it worked. Rigidity bent to practicality, and the war effort gained. The men who flew with him in 1944 never forgot. In interviews decades later, 475th veterans spoke with respect about the civilian who flew as their equal and taught them to stretch farther than they'd thought possible. Colonel Warren Lewis, who led the 402nd, could still recite Lindbergh's fuel settings years later. Details differ in accounts, adjusted for conditions and aircraft blocks, but the principle stayed the same and the results were plain. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at 72 of lymphoma at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. He slipped away from Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York on August 17th and reached Maui a week before the end. He was buried about 3 hours after death in a simple handmade coffin built by Hawaiian ranch cowboys in work clothes in a grave 30 ft deep lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles at Palapalahu Church Cemetery. Only 15 people attended. The marker is a plain concrete slab with a line from Psalm 139. If I Take the Wings of the Morning and Dwell in the Uttermost Parts of the Sea. His wartime journals, published in 1970, give detailed accounts of his Pacific months, including his time with the 475th. Lindbergh's legacy in the Pacific goes beyond specific numbers and settings. He illustrated principles that still matter. Technical mastery affects combat. Civilian experts can help, if they're allowed in. Procedures should be questioned and improved when evidence backs change. Demonstration works better than argument. And above all, there is always room to do better, even with systems that look fully refined. In the end, Lindbergh's achievement was a rare meeting of special knowledge and urgent need. The Pacific demanded extreme fighter range. Existing habits kept range below what the airplane could actually do. Lindbergh had unique fuel management know-how built over decades. He got the chance to apply it in combat, where results could be measured. He had the nerve to prove it personally, and the humility to work with pilots as a peer instead of trading on celebrity. The story of German prisoners of war grasping American industrial abundance shows how material facts can change minds. Lindbergh's story shows how demonstrated technique can change operations. Both remind us that decisive gains sometimes come not from force, but from knowledge applied precisely and proven in the field. The prisoners went home knowing prosperity could overwhelm scarcity. The American fighter pilots who learned from Lindbergh gained methods that multiplied their impact and brought more of them home. The P-38 Lightning flew to war's end, its twin boom outline a symbol of American air power in the Pacific. The pilots who flew it remember the airplane fondly despite its quirks, and those who flew it in 1944 remember the civilian who taught them that impossible really meant difficult, that published limits were starting points, and that insight can unlock hidden capability. That is Lindbergh's Pacific legacy, not a tally of victories, but knowledge passed on and techniques taught. He arrived as an observer and left a teacher, came as a celebrity and departed a comrade, and he transformed an aircraft's reach by understanding how it truly worked and having the courage to prove a better way. The pilots of Satan's angels knew what he gave them. They ranged farther, fought longer, and came home safer because a civilian understood fuel economy better than anyone else in the Pacific. That know-how, proven in combat and adopted across the theater, stands as one of the Pacific Air War's most successful technical innovations. And it didn't come from a lab or an engineering shop, but from one man's specialized craft, perfected 17 years earlier over the Atlantic. Applied in a new setting with different machines, that mastery was as valuable in 1944 as it had been in 1927. The core stayed the same. Know the airplane completely, manage resources precisely, and never assume printed limits are real limits. Lindbergh lived that rule, and for 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, he taught it to some of the Pacific's best, who in turn spread it to others, passing on knowledge that changed how America fought the air war in the Pacific.